Now, a few weeks back, we were looking at chapter 12 of Genesis at verses 1 through to 9. And that Sunday, we looked at the call of Abram. You'll remember how we heard all about the promises that God made to him, to this man Abram, who at that time was living as a pagan, but God called him. God called him, and Abram heard God's call and was obedient. And the Bible talks about Abram's faith over and over again in Scripture. We hear about the faith of Abram, which is to be our example. Now today we move forward. We're looking at the rest of chapter 12, which today, as our title says, we're thinking about the fact that the promises of God, that the blessing which was promised by God, was put at risk in the events that we're hearing about this morning. So the promised blessing put at risk, that's our title for this morning. Now, as I said to the kids, Abram is one of the heroes of the Bible. He's one of the great examples of Christian faith. And here we have a whole episode which doesn't paint Abram in a very positive light at all. In fact, anything the opposite. In fact, but the Bible, you see, never hides the mistakes of even the most good and godly examples. We need to remember that. We'll see that again today. And the reason I think for that is because even the failures of those people point us forward to someone who is perfect, someone who wouldn't make those same mistakes. And as we read about the failures of the heroes like Abram and others, we're reminded that we need someone even better, someone even greater, and that someone is Jesus. So in verses 10 through to 13 of the verses, or the passage that Michal read for us, we see that sadly even God's people often respond to danger with deception. That's our title, our first heading for this morning. God's people often respond to danger with deception. Now, just like in previous sermons in this Genesis series, the reference that I found most useful was a book by a guy called Alan Ross, and it's his headings that I'm mostly using today. Now, to discover the message of this passage this morning, we need to understand what Abram did wrong. And we need to figure out and understand how God got things back on track again. So that's our task this morning as we enter into this passage. Now basically, Abram's plan was due to fear. It went badly wrong, and the Lord stepped in. Abram's plan, yes, in some ways he had good motives, but basically his plan was one of deception and deceit. And the reason that deception was necessary, it all started with this journey to Egypt. And that was due to the famine in Canaan at that time, a severe famine in the land of Canaan, the promised land, this land that God had promised to give to Abram's descendants. The famine there led to Abram deciding that they should go as a family to Egypt. He and Sarah and their household, their servants, their animals, that they all should up and leave, and they should go to Egypt, not permanently, but just temporarily until this famine would pass. So in many ways that was a sensible enough move. They weren't abandoning the land that God had promised to them. They were only going to Egypt until the famine was over. So it wasn't wrong. But neither was it motivated by faith. No, it seems to be purely a practical decision by Abram. Now, Abram's words to Sarai, just before they entered the promised land, reveal a danger that Abram had realized would face him when they got to Egypt. And as we heard in the reading, and even earlier in the service in the kids' talk, the problem is an odd problem to have, but Sarah was very attractive, and he was worried that if the people in Egypt, if they realized that he was Sarah's husband, that they would kill him so that they could have her. So it was quite a predicament. And plus Abram realized, he knew that if he died, then God's promise of blessing died with him too. Now, Abram's plan didn't, as I've said already, didn't come from faith. It came from fear. He wasn't being strong and courageous. He wasn't trusting in God as we sang in our kids' song today. His plan, what he wanted Sarah to do, was to tell the Egyptians that he was her brother rather than her husband. And that way, if anyone wanted to marry her, they would have to come and talk to him as her relative, as her brother. They would have to negotiate the bride price or the dowry. And that would be the trigger, that would be the indicator, the prompt that they needed, that it was time for them to up and leave. It was time for them to escape if that was to happen. Now notice how cunning their deception was. Because, Sarah was Abram's, not sister, but half-sister. They had the same father, Terah, but different mothers. So yes, they were half. She was his half-sister, not his sister. Now, to us that sounds weird. We think that's mad. You don't do that. And, we think that's not allowed. But it hadn't yet been forbidden by God. That came later in the Bible's timeline. Later on, whenever God gave his law to the people, that's when it became forbidden to marry, for them to have been married. But earlier in the history, it hadn't yet been forbidden by God. So there was nothing in that regard. There was nothing wrong with their relationship. So technically they weren't lying, but they were misleading. They were deceiving by withholding the fact that they were husband and wife, which is essentially what anybody wanted to know when they asked about their relationship. That's what they wanted to know. Are you husband and wife? By saying, she's my sister, or he's my brother. That didn't answer the question that people were actually wanting to find an answer to. Verse 13 tells us that Abram's reasoning was that, what was behind the plan was so that it would go well for him and that his life would be spared. So it was motivated by fear. You see, Abram was satisfied that Sarai, his wife, she would be safe, but he feared that his own life was in danger. And so to protect his life, to protect their marriage, and to protect the promises of God, they would deceive the Egyptians. Out of fear, Abram persuades Sarai to pretend that she is merely his sister. And so now you can see why God's people often respond to danger with deception. You can see why that's our heading for this section. And by doing so, Abram displays a lack of trust in God's protection. He should have trusted that God would be able to protect them there in the land of Egypt. But no, they came up with a different plan, a sinful plan instead. But I wonder, has that ever been true of you? I suspect it has, because I know it's been true of me. Sometimes we display a lack of faith by coming up with some dubious, questionable method of avoiding some circumstance some circumstance that we want to avoid. You could probably fill in the gaps and think of scenarios perhaps in your own life where you felt that the only way out was to do something that you know was not quite what God would have you do. As we move on then into verses 14 to 16, we see that deception may put the promised blessing at risk. This is the central section. This is the bit that I guess comes closest to the title for the sermon this morning. That deception may put the promised blessing at risk. Yes, Abram was right. When they got to Egypt, the Egyptians noticed Sarah's attractive appearance. Verse 14 says, when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And the problem then came in verse 15, because the palace officials saw Sarai, and they told the Pharaoh about Sarai, this beautiful woman who had come to Egypt with her brother, or so they thought. And Sarai is taken to the Pharaoh's harem. Both Abram and Sarai were powerless to do anything to resist the mighty ruler of this powerful nation. You see, Abram's plan would have worked with an ordinary Egyptian. They would have had to have those negotiations about the bride price, etc. And that would have been, as I've mentioned, that would have been their trigger, the prompt that it was time for them to scarper. But not when it's the Pharaoh who comes and takes Sarai. There was no need for him to negotiate with anyone. This powerful ruler could take her without any conversation. Now, ironically, verse 16 tells us that Abram was treated well by the Pharaoh because of Sarai. Not only did Abram stay alive, but he was given sheep and donkeys and camels and oxen and servants. In other words, Abram became very wealthy. But he had lost Sarai. He had lost his wife. And this new wealth would only ever be a constant reminder of that fact. Alan Ross, he points out that just like in Eden, remember back at the start of this series, we heard about what the events that happened in Eden. But just like in Eden, when Adam and Eve were disobedient, taking the forbidden fruit, this fruit that God said was off limits, resulting in them feeling fear and feeling that they were naked and blaming each other, leading to the intimacy of their relationship as husband and wife being broken. Well, in a very similar way, here in Genesis 12, we have Abram and Sarah. We have fear leading to deception, resulting in Pharaoh taking what God had put off limits, namely Abram's wife, Sarai. And again, the result is that the intimacy of this husband and wife is broken. Another terrible mess caused by human sin. And the same happens in our lives too, whenever we depart from God's ways. The result is only ever a mess. It's misery and pain. Now, for Abram and Sarai, God would prevent things from going further by sorting out the mess, because his promise of blessing had been put at risk. And that takes us then to our final heading for this morning, which is that at times the Lord intervenes to protect his promised blessing. And here we're looking at verses 17 through to 20. Abram had created this terrible situation and had put God's promises in danger. And what's God going to do? Well, verse 17, we're told that the Lord caused Pharaoh and his household to suffer. Well, to suffer terrible, we suspect terrible diseases. The Hebrew it refers to something very intense or very severe. It stresses the severity of what happened, and the word literally means blows. We suspect it was probably diseases. And we're not told what those diseases were, or what afflictions God caused, or how they realized that it was due to Sarai. Perhaps everyone else was sick and Sarai wasn't. Maybe she was unaffected. What we are told is that the Lord did all of this to sort out the problem caused by Abram's deceit. Now, centuries later, whenever Abram's descendants, the Hebrews, the Israelites, whenever they were living in the land of Egypt as slaves, they were living in the land at the time when God brought the 10 plagues. They would have known about this episode earlier in their own history. They would have known about Abram's life, and they could relate to this episode. They would have been encouraged to realize that just like with Abram, the Lord was using the 10 plagues in their day, using the 10 plagues to bring about his plan, a plan to bless them, his people, and then through them to bless all people, to bless all humanity ultimately. And don't forget, that same God is still at work today, and his power, his ability is just as absolute today as it was back then when the events of today's passage took place. Only God's intervention could save Sarai. Only God's intervention could save her unharmed from Pharaoh's harem, which is what he did. But later in Israel's history, there were times when the Lord did not immediately rescue them from terrible difficulties, the terrible difficulties that they'd gotten themselves into as a result of their sin. There were times when God didn't do that, and not immediately, certainly. That was especially true on occasions when God had repeatedly warned the people that their sin was going to lead to going to lead to consequences which were effectively his punishment for their sin. He did that using the prophets. And on occasions, even though they heard the prophets warning them again and again and again, they still persisted in their sin. And God's rescue did not come. So at times, God may rescue his people, but at other times he might not, or not as quickly as we might like. But let's get back to Abram and Sarai. The mess that they were in, although they had caused it, they couldn't fix it. Only God could. And God did. God did it because his promise was at stake. His holy name and the honor of his holy name was at stake. And so he intervened. In verse 18, not surprisingly, the Pharaoh had Abram brought in, and he rebuked Abram for deceiving him. Yes, Abram was guilty, just like Pharaoh said, and that guilt had consequences. It had caused terrible suffering for Pharaoh and for Pharaoh's household. And Pharaoh gave Sarai back to Abram. Gave her back to him unharmed, saying, "Take her and go." It seems that the Pharaoh had taken Sarai into his harem, but had not yet taken her into his bed as one of his wives. And so he could return her to Abram as Abram's wife. And then to be sure that this whole terrible episode with Abram was over, verse 20 tells us though that the Pharaoh had his men escort them out of Egypt. It was a humiliating, shameful eviction, but thoroughly deserved. The relationship between Abram and the Pharaoh was utterly broken. For Abram, there could be no going back to Egypt. He's not welcome there anymore. Which meant that at the same time, the Pharaoh had separated himself and his people from God's blessing. He separated them from Abram's God, and therefore from the blessing, the promised blessing. Now remember the context. Remember the backdrop to this whole episode. The Lord's plan is to raise up a nation who would be his people. And he was planning to do that through Abram and Sarai. A nation from which would come a seed who would bring blessing to all people, bring blessing to the world. A seed which we now know, or who we now know, is Jesus. Now that's the big story, that's the overarching story, but notice how God moves that amazing plan forward through the lives of his people, including difficult situations like this one, caused by Abram and his attempts to deceive. As Moses taught these events to the Israelites, they would have learned how God graciously protects his plans and his purposes. And he does that by intervening when his people mess things up, like with Abram's deception here in Genesis chapter 12. Moses would have taught them that it's crazy, absolutely crazy, to attempt to rescue yourself from threatening situations by using deception or by any other sinful method. As Alan Ross puts it in his book, sinful acts can never save God's people from threatening situations because evil cannot bring about good. We need to make sure that we have learned that lesson too. Sinful solutions, no matter how appealing they might be, sinful solutions are never part of God's solution. At the end of chapter 12, it appears that Abram prospered from his deception. Remember all of the animals that he left Egypt with. He left Egypt a rich man. But it shouldn't surprise us that these possessions, gotten by dishonesty, repeatedly they caused Abram trouble in the years ahead. For example, next week when we get into chapter 13, we're going to discover that these vast herds of animals meant that Abram and his nephew Lot, they had to separate and go their separate ways. And how that, in time, that led to Lot ending up in the whole escapade around Sodom and Gomorrah that we'll get to in a few weeks' time. And think too of all of the misery caused by the tension over an Egyptian maid called Hagar, who was probably one of the servants given to Abram in verse 16. Deception or sin of any kind always has consequences, some of which we'll have to live with for years. So we need to ask God's help in resisting the temptation to sin, especially when that sin seems like the easy way out. We also need to realize that our faith in God is most visible to others when it costs us to believe. When others realize that we're not choosing the easy route, but standing by our trust and faith in God, that speaks to people. And so we need to pray that God would help us to learn to trust Him. God would help us to learn to keep our faith firmly in Him, no matter what circumstances we're facing. And lastly, we need to remember that our mistakes do not define our usefulness to God. Graciously and gloriously, He can use each and every one of us in His plans. Just think of all of the messed up people that God uses in Scripture. If He can use them, then He can certainly use us too. Let's take a moment to pray.